This is a spoken summary of the third and final part of E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. Part 3 is titled The Working Class Presence, where Part 1 traced the traditions of popular radicalism, and Part 2 the experience of exploitation. Part 3 follows the emergence of a self-conscious working class into open political life, from the reborn radicalism of Westminster, through the underground world of Luddism and the trade societies, to the martyrdoms of Pentrich and Peterloo, and at last to the mature class consciousness of the years around the Reform Bill. By 1832, Thompson will argue, the working class was no longer in the making, but had been made. Chapter 13. Radical Westminster. Popular radicalism, Thompson argues, was not extinguished by Pitt's repression of the 1790s. It simply lost coherence, becoming what he calls an incoherent presence through the years of war. Between 1802 and 1807, it re-emerged, but transformed. The French-inspired Jacobinism of the previous decade was dying, killed, Thompson says, by Napoleon's usurpation of the Republic. Sheridan declared that Jacobinism was killed and gone, and by whom? By Bonaparte. No true follower of Paine could stomach an emperor. In its place, a new, indigenous radicalism was reborn, and its cradle was the open householder franchise of Westminster. The Foxite Whigs had seceded from Parliament in 1797, retiring to Holland House, leaving a handful of independent men to defend the old liberties. William Cobbett, who had returned from America as an anti-Jacobin and founded his political register in 1802 with the help of the War Minister Windham, swung round after 1804 against the Pitt system, attacking the placemen and pensioners, the funding system, and the paper money, what he would come to call old corruption. His Toryism, his nostalgia for a plain, sturdy, constitutional Englishman, allowed reformers to regroup past the old anti-Jacobin prejudice. The turning point was the Westminster election of 1807. In 1806, Francis Place had watched with disgust as the Duke of Northumberland's liveried servants threw bread and cheese and beer to a servile mob. Cobbett redefined independence as the elector's duty to free himself from such patronage. In 1807, Place's committee, working without bribery or treating, returned Sir Francis Burdett and Lord Cochrane in triumph, and Westminster, Thompson writes, was never lost to radicalism. Place recalled that the committee were all of them obscure persons, as insignificant a set of persons as could well have been collected together to undertake so important a matter. Yet Thompson calls the victory a halfway house, still bounded by the property qualification that confined candidates to men of means, and he ends the chapter on the crucial contrast that will shape all that follows. In London, radicalism found an open committee and the safety valve of elections. But north of the Trent, he writes, radicalism was driven underground into the world of the illegal trade union, the secret meeting, and the oath. The Westminster Committee had no message for the Luddites. Thompson fills in the years between the repression of the 90s and the revival. During the Peace of Amiens, at the election of 1802, advanced candidates won surprising successes. At Nottingham, a band played the Marseillaise, and a woman appeared as the goddess of reason, and Cobbett, still an anti-Jacobin, called it a Republican revolutionary mob. Burdett made his name, championing the habeas corpus prisoners, held in the Coldbath Fields House of Correction, whose appeal had been written, it was said, on the flyleaf of a book with a splinter of wood dipped in blood. His slogan was No Bastille, and at the Middlesex election of 1804, he was declared elected by a majority of 1, only to have it reversed the next morning on a technicality. Meanwhile, French Jacobinism died at home, as Napoleon made himself consul for life, and then hereditary emperor. When Fox died, the Westminster contest of 1806 and 1807 broke the grip of the great factions. James Paul, the son of a Perth tailor, and Cobbett's gamecock, came within a few hundred votes of Sheridan, and the following year Burdett and Cochrane were carried in. The committee that achieved it, Thompson stresses, invented the modern democratic canvass. The old corresponding society man Lemaitre devised the street-by-street organization, and Place worked unpaid from a coffee house, disdaining all bribery and treating. Yet the property qualification kept the movement within bounds, and when Burdett was sent to the Tower in 1810 for defending the imprisoned John Gale Jones, the limits of this gentlemanly radicalism were plain. In London there was the Open Committee. North of the Trent, Thompson repeats, there was the illegal tradition, and the Westminster Committee had no message for the Luddites. Thompson dwells on the death of the old Jacobinism as the precondition of the new movement. Napoleon's coronation, he says, freed English reformers from the taint of France, and allowed a man like Cobbett, whose instincts were deeply conservative, to become the greatest tribune of the radical cause, without ever quite ceasing to be a Tory. The paradox is central to Thompson's whole account. It was a nostalgia for an older, sturdier England, a hatred of the tax-eater, and the borough-monger, and the paper-money men, that first gave the post-war movement its language. And it is in the contrast between the metropolitan and the provincial that the chapter finds its lasting significance, for the difference between an open, electoral, committee-led radicalism in London and a driven underground, oath-bound tradition in the North would shape the movement, Thompson says, for half a century. Chapter 14. An Army of Redressors. Beneath the visible, articulate radicalism of London, Thompson argues, ran an illegal tradition, an underground stretching from the conspiracy of Colonel Despard, executed in 1803, to the rising of Jeremiah Brandreth 14 years later. Brandreth, indeed, had witnessed Despard's execution. This chapter, the longest in the book, is Thompson's great reinterpretation of Luddism. He insists that the machine breaking of 1811 to 1817 was not blind or mindless, but a quasi-insurrectionary movement, disciplined and organized, arising at the precise point where the old paternalist legislation that had protected the trades was abrogated and laissez-faire imposed, in his phrase, against the will and conscience of the working people. Luddism embodied an alternative moral economy of the just price and the fair wage, and it trembled, again and again, on the edge of ulterior revolutionary aims. He opens with the underground of the turn of the century, the secret oath-bound societies of United Britons and United Englishmen, the night meetings on the moors where, in one report, an orator in a mask harangued the people, read letters from distant societies by the light of a candle, and immediately burned them. The mayor of Leeds wrote to the Lord Lieutenant of a committee that called itself the Black Lamp, each member swearing in 9 more, with the aim of the abolition of all taxes and the full enjoyment of their rights. Colonel Despard, an Irishman of distinguished record for whom Nelson himself testified, was arrested in a Lambeth tavern with some 40 workmen and soldiers, and executed in 1803 on a charge of conspiring to seize the Tower and the Bank and to assassinate the king. Thompson concludes that a real conspiracy existed, but that Despard, who kept a loyal silence to the end, linked Irish nationalism, London labourers, and the northern croppers and weavers in a single thread. He then reflects, in a section he calls the Opaque Society, on the extraordinary difficulty of the evidence. The sources are clouded from 3 directions. By a government that needed conspirators and paid its spies by the piece, so that its committees of secrecy produced lurid and unsubstantiated allegations, one of which H.G. Bennett hurled to the floor of the House as trash fit only for trampling under his feet, by the partisan archives of Francis Place, who knew little of the Midlands and the North and despised the illegal unions, and by working people who intended their own secrets to be opaque, in a solidarity that was not only a solidarity with, but a solidarity against. There were, Thompson writes, 2 cultures in England. Yet, he cautions, the employers were not all fools. They checked their informers, reports, and the government succeeded remarkably in penetrating political organizations while failing to penetrate the local industrial ones. The framework knitters, leader Grosvenor Henson, stands for that impenetrability, a man of lifelong repugnance to disclose the secrets of the trade. In the section on the laws against combination, he argues that Pitt's Combination Act of 1799 unwittingly brought the Jacobin tradition into association with the illegal unions, so that the old patriotic and constitutional societies became simply union societies. Yet trade unionism advanced in spite of the acts. The Webbs judged the London crafts never more completely organized than between 1800 and 1820. The acts were, in one historian's phrase, an odious piece of class legislation. But prosecutions were often brought instead under the common law of conspiracy or under the Elizabethan statute against leaving work unfinished. He describes the machinery of secrecy the unions borrowed from Methodism, the classes and the delegates, the oaths sworn before the figure of death, the Huddersfield Society that bought a pistol, a Bible, and 10 yards of curtain material, and the Nottingham men who said, "If you will find jails, we will find bodies." The section called Croppers and Stockingers supplies the industrial context of the risings. Luddism was confined to 3 trades and areas: the croppers, or shearmen, of the West Riding, the cotton weavers of South Lancashire, and the framework knitters of Nottingham, Leicester, and Derby. The croppers were a skilled aristocracy, earning some 30 shillings a week, wielding shears 4 feet long and weighing 40 pounds, and they were threatened by the gig mill and the shearing frame. They appealed to old statutes, to the statute of artificers, and to a law of Edward VI, and raised 10 or 12,000 pounds for their legal and parliamentary campaign. When, in 1809, all the protective legislation of the woolen trade was repealed, the road to any constitutional redress was, in Thompson's words, finally blocked. The framework knitters, some 50,000 of them, suffered from frame rents, from truck, from cut-ups and colting, the making of cheap goods by unskilled labor. Their song promised that they would break the frames until full-fashioned work at the old-fashioned price was established by custom and by law. Ned Ludd was styled the general of the army of redressors, the defender of ancient right. The narrative itself Thompson tells in this section he calls the Sherwood Lads. Nottingham Luddism began in March 1811 and reached its disciplined height that winter, when perhaps 1,000 frames were destroyed. Only the wide frames and the underpriced frames were broken, never the trade at large. In February 1812, frame-breaking was made a capital felony, against which Byron delivered his maiden speech in the Lords. In Yorkshire, the croppers took up the hammers they called Enochs, after their maker Enoch Taylor, saying, "Enoch made them, Enoch shall break them." In April 1812, some 150 Luddites under George Mellor attacked William Cartwright's mill at Rawfolds and were beaten off, leaving 2 dying men behind. Days later, the manufacturer William Horsfall was assassinated on the moor. 12,000 troops were poured into the disturbed counties, more than Wellington then commanded in the peninsula. In Lancashire, where the movement was most entangled with riot and provocation, there were deadly affrays at Middleton and Westhalton. The York Special Commission of January 1813 hanged Mellor and 2 others for Horsfall's murder, and 14 more for the mill attacks and arms raids, and transported others for oath-taking. A last Midlands phase in 1816 and 1817 ended with the execution of Jem Towle and 6 others. Finally, in the section by order of the trade, Thompson delivers his interpretation. He rejects the view of the Hammonds and of Darvall, who had denied any political content and declared that there is no evidence whatever of any political motives on the part of the Luddites. Such a conclusion, he says, is as unlikely as the most sensational conspiracy theory, for scores of armed and drilled and numbered men do not assemble with the innocence of a college prank. He explains the movement's development. Nottingham began as trade union enforcement and was driven by outlawry toward insurrection, while Yorkshire moved from the croppers' grievances toward general revolutionary aims. The authorities, he shows, deliberately limited their prosecutions to overt acts, avoiding the unpopular and legally doubtful charge of treason. And the solidarity of the communities held. The informer was treated as a Judas, and Benjamin Walker, who betrayed Mellor, never got his reward and ended a beggar. Cobbett caught the essence when he wrote of the government secret committee that they can find no agitators. It is a movement of the people's own. Luddism, Thompson concludes, was the nearest thing to a peasant's revolt of industrial workers, and the Luddites were at once some of the last of the guildsmen and some of the first to launch the agitations that lead on to the 10 Hours movement. Thompson gives the underground its faces and its places. Despard was arrested at the Oakley Arms in Lambeth with some 40 workmen and soldiers, and at his trial, Nelson testified that they had gone on the Spanish Main together. 6 guardsmen died with him on the scaffold. The chapter's methodological heart, which Thompson calls the opaque society, distinguishes the 2 kinds of informer, the debtor who bought his freedom by turning spy, and the reformer who turned his coat, and warns of the regional distortions of the record. Bolton over-reported through the zealous magistrates Fletcher and Bancroft. Fitzwilliam's Yorkshire under-reported. Grevner Henson, the framework knitter's leader and historian of his own trade, stands for the impenetrable local organization, and would himself be arrested in London in 1817 under the suspended habeas corpus. On the Combination Acts, Thompson notes that the Privy Council singled out the croppers, whose despotic power, it said, almost exceeds belief, and that their institution held a general purse of over £1,000, while West Country mills burned. When the Woolen Committee of 1806 examined them, it warned that such combinations were still more alarming in a political than in a commercial view. He carries the story to the repeal of the Combination Acts in 1824 and 1825, engineered by Place and Joseph Hume, after which John Doherty of the Cotton Spinners warned that any reenactment would bring a widespread revolutionary movement. The narrative of the risings he tells in detail, the Bulwell affray in which John Wesley of Arnold was killed, the frame-breaking made capital in February 1812 against which Byron spoke, the United Committee of Henson, Latham, and Large whose regulating bill was emasculated by the Commons and thrown out by the Lords, Sidmouth trusting in God that no such principle would return, the attack on Cartwright's mill at Rawfolds, where the boy John Booth, dying, taunted the parson who pressed him to inform, "Can you keep a secret?" The assassination of the Prime Minister The York Special Commission hanged Mellor and 16 others, whose trades, Thompson notes, were mostly croppers. In his interpretation, he cites the Barnsley man, Thomas Broughton, who twisted in 200 men and swore that the Luddites had in view ultimately to overturn the system of government. He shows that the papers taken after one Yorkshire meeting bore a constitution and an oath identical to Despard's, linking the undergrounds of 1802 and 1812. And he lets Cobbett have the last word on the government's secret committee, that they can find no agitators, for it is a movement of the people's own. Thompson sets the suspension diffusion of ideas beside the tighter organization of the Luddites to show that the illegal tradition never had a single center. Jacobinism, he writes, had become indigenous in the working-class communities. Its texts passed hand to hand from the mountains above Merthyr to the back rooms of London booksellers. The ritual of the oath he reconstructs from a Yorkshire inquest, the recruit blindfolded, the password Alpha and Omega, the picture of death inscribed "Remember thy end," the reading of the 94th Psalm. The motto of Henson's own association was simply, "Keep quiet." The croppers' grievance he grounds in the machines that threatened them, the gig mill, long forbidden under a statute of Edward VI, and the shearing frame, and the stockingers, in the wide frames in the cut-ups. The disciplined Nottingham phase of the winter of 1811, he records, destroyed perhaps 1,000 frames, 70 at Sutton and Ashfield in a night, and a Leeds newspaper wrote that the county had seen no parallel since the troubled days of Charles I. The Lancashire troubles he judges the least authentic Luddism, tangled with food riot, reform agitation, and provocation, from the Stockport warehouses to the burning of the mill at Westhoughton and the killings at Daniel Burton's power loom mill at Middleton. The York prisoners transported for oath-taking included the old Halifax Democrat John Baines, the last Midlands attack on Heathcote and Bowden's Loughborough factory, Jem Towell, called a Waterloo job, £6,000 of damage, and cost him and 6 others their lives. The funerals of the Luddite dead became demonstrations and clashed, Thompson notes, with the discipline of the Methodist leader Jabez Bunting. General Maitland reported that he could find no real bottom to the movement, and Thompson's verdict is that Luddism was the nearest thing England knew to a peasant's revolt of industrial workers, its men at once among the last of the guildsmen and among the first of a new age of labor agitation. Thompson insists that the historian must read the clouded record with care, but not with despair. The magistrates, he says, were at the mercy of their informants, and the great collector of Luddite memory, Frank Peel, gathered the testimony of survivors, one of whom, in his dotage, still sang the old Luddite songs to his grandchildren. On the combination laws, he cites the Webbs, that the London crafts were never more completely organized than between 1800 and 1820, and notes that prosecutions were often brought under the Elizabethan statute against leaving work unfinished rather than under the Combination Acts themselves. Earl Fitzwilliam, once tolerant, came to call the croppers the tyrants of the country, and Benjamin Gott's 80 croppers struck in 1802. The croppers, Thompson quotes, were strictly speaking not servants, and they raised £10,000 or £12,000 for their cause. Their song, General Ludd's Triumph, promised to break the frames until full-fashioned work at the old-fashioned price was established by custom and by law. He tells the narrative in its stages, the first 60 frames broken at Arnold in March 1811, the manufacturer Trentham shot and wounded at Nottingham, the Yorkshire leaflets that cried, "Come, let us follow the noble example of the brave citizens of Paris," the 150 men under Mellor at Rawfolds, and the 2 left dying, among them the 19-year-old John Booth, a clergyman's son, the 12,000 troops in the disturbed counties. The solidarity of the communities was absolute. Benjamin Walker, who informed on Mellor, never received his £2,000 and ended a beggar, and Mellor said that he would rather stand in his own place than in that of his accuser. Papers taken after one Yorkshire meeting bore a constitution and an oath identical with Despard's, chaining the underground of 1802 to that of 1812, and General Maitland confessed that he could find no real bottom to it all. The illegal tradition, Thompson argues, never had a single center or a single conspiracy. Jacobinism had simply become indigenous in the working-class communities, and Paine's writings passed from hand to hand, in the mountain villages above Merthyr as in the back rooms of London. He is scrupulous about the informers who fill the record. The Manchester Deputy Constable Nadine was suspected of trafficking in the rewards for convictions, the so-called Tyburn tickets. The informer, known only as B, long taken for a provocateur, Thompson reassesses as a plain informer who reported what he saw, and he warns that the very man who paid for information could not always tell truth from invention. Against the government's need for conspirators, he sets the community's need for silence, and finds the balance in the fact that the state penetrated the political organizations far more easily than the local industrial ones. He notes the framework knitters, clergyman magistrate Becher, who blamed Luddism on Jacobinical principles sown by the Nottingham reformers, and he lets the geography of the risings speak. In Lancashire, the movement was most entangled with riot and provocation. The Manchester Exchange was sacked in April 1812 after the crowd's disappointment with the Prince Regent, and the burning of the mill at Westaughton was shot through with the work of Colonel Fletcher's paid provocateurs. The York prisoners of 1813, when their trades were counted, proved to be overwhelmingly croppers, with a scattering of laborers, weavers, and shoemakers. And the papers seized after the risings pointed two ways at once. One Yorkshire letter of March 1812 was purely industrial in its demands, while another called for a just republic to be set up with French help, so that the movement, in Thompson's reading, shaded from trade union enforcement at one end into revolutionary hope at the other. Byron had mocked the whole affair as a matter of marchings and countermarchings. Thompson answers that men do not march and countermarch by night, armed and sworn and numbered for nothing. The Luddite, he concludes, appealed always to an ancient right, to the statute of artificers and to the charter of Charles II, and issued his declaration in the name of custom and of law. He was a rebel in defense of the past, and it is that, Thompson says, which gives Luddism its tragic dignity. The Despard affair repays the closer attention Thompson gives it. The colonel was said to have planned to seize the tower and the bank, to stop the mail coaches as a signal to the country, and to assassinate the king. He was taken at a Lambeth public house among some 40 laborers and soldiers, and the taverns named in the evidence, the Flying Horse, the Bleeding Heart, mapped the underground world of the London poor. 6 guardsmen died with him, and he went to the scaffold in silence. Thompson finds in the episode the pattern of the whole illegal tradition, a real core of conspiracy drawing in Irish nationalists, London working men, and northern croppers and weavers, magnified and distorted by a government that needed a plot. He restores, too, the texture of the northern underground, the twisting in oaths to the United Britons, the night meetings on the moors, the framework knitters, leader Gravner Henson raising funds and legal aid for the prisoners, while keeping the secrets of the trade to the grave, the narrative of Rawfolds he tells in full, the 150 men mustering by night, the attack on Cartwright's fortified mill beaten back with musketry, the 2 mortally wounded men left behind, one of them the boy John Booth, who, dying, drew the clergyman close with the question, "Can you keep a secret?" and then said, "So can I." Days later, William Horsfall was shot dead on Crosland Moor, and George Mellor was hanged for it at York with 2 companions, while 14 more went to the gallows for the mill attacks and the arms raids, and others were transported for the oath. At the trials, Thompson notes, the authorities deliberately confined the charges to overt acts, and shunned the doubtful, unpopular charge of high treason. A Manchester jury had already acquitted 38. And the deepest meaning of Luddism, he argues, lies in its double face. It was at once the last defensive struggle of the old skilled trades, appealing to statutes and charters and the memory of a regulated economy, and the first stirring of the movements, the trade unions, and the 10 hours agitation that would carry the working class forward. In that sense, the Luddites stood, as Thompson puts it, at the meeting point of 2 worlds. Thompson dwells on the grievances that drove the framework knitters, for they show that Luddism was a defense of standards, and not a hatred of machinery as such. The stockingers suffered from the frame rents charged by the hosiers, whether they had work or not, from payment in truck, and above all from the cut-ups. whole pieces of cheap material cut and seamed into imitation stockings. And from colting, the flooding of the trade with unapprenticed boys. The Nottingham Review itself observed that there was no new machinery against which the workmen directed their vengeance. Only the wide frames and the frames used for fraudulent work were broken. The knitters appealed to a clause in the charter of Charles II, which had empowered the trade's deputies to cut up deceitful goods, and to the old apprenticeship law, and they mounted, through Henson's United Committee, a serious parliamentary campaign for the regulation of their trade, which the Commons emasculated and the Lords threw out. Only when that constitutional road was blocked did frame-breaking pass into something like insurrection. This is the pattern Thompson finds everywhere in the illegal years. A lawful appeal to custom and to Parliament, its rejection, and then the turn to direct action, so that the violence of the Luddites was, in his reading, less the cause than the consequence of the abrogation of the old paternalist code. The oaths and the secrecy, which so alarmed the government, he treats as the natural forms of a movement that had been driven outside the law, and as authentic evidence of a whole counterculture, with its own discipline, its own loyalties, and its own bitter code against the informer. The executioner who held up the colonel's head to the crowd with the cry, "Behold, the head of a traitor," gave the illegal tradition its grim opening image, and Thompson uses it to frame the whole span from Despard to Brandreth. He is careful to weigh how far the authorities themselves understood what they faced. 2 London magistrates sent to Nottingham reported that almost every creature of the lower order, both in town and country, were on the Luddite side, and it was this depth of community support, not any single directing committee, that made the movement so hard to break. He returns to the Combination Acts to make a subtle point. Pitt's Act of 1799, meant to crush the unions, in fact, drove them into the arms of the Jacobin underground, so that the old patriotic and constitutional clubs became simply union societies, and industrial and political disaffection ran together in a single channel. Yet trade unionism did not die. The Webbs judged the London crafts more completely organized in these years than ever before, and the men found 100 ways round the law, prosecuting their combinations under cover of sick clubs and benefit societies. The turning point of the whole story, Thompson insists, was the repeal in 1809 of the ancient legislation that had protected the woolen trade, the apprenticeship laws, the ban on the gig mill, the limit on the number of looms. With that, the road to any constitutional redress was finally blocked, and Ned Ludd, the mythical general of the army of redressors, took the field as the defender of an ancient right that Parliament had abolished. And when the men were hanged, their funerals became demonstrations, great silent processions that the authorities watched with dread, and that the Methodist leader Jabez Bunting struggled in vain to suppress. Behind the breaking of frames, Thompson insists, lay a whole conception of how a trade ought to be governed. The Luddites were fighting not against machinery in the abstract, but against the use of machinery to cheapen the product, to flood the trade with unskilled labor, and to destroy the customary standards of price and quality. Theirs was a defense of the just price and the fair wage against the unregulated market, a last stand of the old moral economy in the sphere of production. That is why Thompson can say that Luddism trembled always on the edge of ulterior aims, for a movement that demanded the regulation of a whole industry, against the whole drift of the age and the settled will of Parliament, was driven, whether it wished it or not, toward a challenge to the political order itself. The deepest importance of the illegal tradition, for Thompson, is that it forms the missing link between the open Jacobinism of the 1790s and the mass radicalism of 1816 to 1820. When Pitt's repression drove the corresponding societies out of existence, the impulse behind them did not die. It went underground, into the oath-bound clubs, the trade combinations and the conspiracies of the years of war, and it re-emerged, transformed and enlarged, when the war was over. Without this underground continuity, he argues, the sudden scale of the post-war movement would be inexplicable. The men who filled the Hampton clubs and marched to Peterloo were not conjured out of nothing by distress, but were the heirs of a tradition that had been kept alive, at great risk, through 20 years of darkness. This is why Thompson takes such pains over evidence that others had dismissed as the invention of spies, for to lose the underground is to lose the thread that binds the whole story together, and to make the working-class movement seem a mere reflex of hunger rather than the continuous, self-renewing thing that it was. Chapter 15. Demagogues and Martyrs. Thompson calls the years from 1815 to 1820 the heroic age of popular radicalism. Where in the 1790s reform had been the creed of a minority, it was now, he says, the response of the whole community. The rights of man were assumed. Yet the movement was chronically weakened by its own leadership, divided between cautious constitutionalists, vain demagogues, and amateurish conspirators, and it possessed no legal national organization. For the Seditious Societies Act of 1799 still made corresponding societies and inter-society correspondence illegal. Only the local club and the right to petition remained lawful. In 1816, Thompson writes, "The English people were held down by force." The section on disaffection sets the scene. The wars ended in 1815 amid distress. The Corn Law of that year was passed with Parliament defended by troops. Disbanded soldiers returned to unemployment. Radicalism became a generalized libertarian rhetoric against the borough-mongering and fund-holding system. Its chief journalistic voice, William Cobbett, its chief platform voice, the great orator Henry Hunt, and its demonology, the Prince Regent, Castlereagh and Sidmouth, the spies Oliver, Castle and Edwards, and the Manchester Yeomanry. Where once only Norwich and Sheffield had been Jacobin, now, Thompson says, from Carlisle to Colchester and from Newcastle to Bristol, the mob was radical. 155 barracks had been built during the wars, sited in the disaffected districts. He illustrates the new communal radicalism with two figures of 1817. Cashman, an Irish sailor cheated of his back pay and hanged after the Spa Fields meeting, who cried from the scaffold, "Now you buggers, give me 3 cheers when I trip," and Samuel Bamford, the Middleton weaver and Hampton Club secretary, arrested by the constable Naden while the whole countryside, he said, was up, the people running like hunters. In Problems of Leadership, Thompson anatomizes the movement's chronic weakness. The Hampton Club, founded in London in 1812, required of its members a landed income of £300 and gave the aged Major Cartwright a base for his evangelizing tours. But Cartwright never intended a working-class movement, believing that pressure for reform was best obtained through the middle classes. The London radicalism of Burdett and Place drifted toward a middle-class alliance and a merely direct taxpayer suffrage. Place, a disciple of Bentham, wrote that it is to the middle class now, as at other times, that the salvation of the country must be confided, and Cobbett dubbed the Westminster Committee the Rump. The alternative was the little society of spension philanthropists, the two Watsons, Arthur Thistlewood, Thomas Preston, Republicans in the Despard tradition, who expected London to play the part of Paris, and whose culpable amateurishness let Sidmouth spies penetrate them with ease. The very structure of the movement, with organization illegal, threw leadership onto individual orators and journalists, and Thompson dissects the resulting cult of the demagogue, Hunt in his white top hat, St. Henry of Ilchester, not so much the leader as the captive of the least stable portion of the crowd. Already, he notes, the movement stood at the dilemma that Chartism would inherit, peaceably if we may, forcibly if we must. The section on the Hampton Clubs finds the movement most vigorous and healthy at the base, in the obscure booksellers and secretaries of Barnsley, Halifax, and Rochdale. The decisive breakthrough was Cobbett's, when in November 1816 he exploited a loophole in the stamp tax to issue his leading articles separately at 2d, the twopenny trash, beginning with his address to the journeymen and laborers. 44,000 were sold by the end of the month, and, Thompson says, no writing had obtained such popular influence since the Rights of Man. The Spencines organized the 3 great Spa Fields meetings of late 1816. The provincial clubs corresponded illegally and sent delegates to a convention at the Crown and Anchor in January 1817, carrying petitions of perhaps 500,000 to 1.5 million signatures. It was here that Cobbett, converted by the modest man from Middleton, Bamford, who pointed to the militia muster rolls as ready-made electoral lists, came out for manhood suffrage. The government answered by suspending habeas corpus and passing a seditious meetings act, and Cobbett, renouncing the political clubs, fled to America, drawing from Wooler and the Black Dwarf the reproach, "For heaven's sake, sir, do not thus betray us." The backbone of the movement, Thompson insists, was not backward yokels but the hand-loom weavers and stockingers of the upland townships, the characteristic workers of this phase of the Industrial Revolution. The section Brandreth and Oliver turns on the problem of the isolated northern centers, 100 or 200 miles from London and easily infiltrated. After the failed march of the Blanketeers, Thompson traces the work of the spy Oliver, sprung from a debtor's jail, who toured the Midlands and the North in the spring of 1817, gaining introductions, attending a central delegate meeting at Wakefield, and pressing the physical force men toward a rising before allowing himself to be seen with the servant of a general, and so exposed. On the night of the 9th of June, 1817, Jeremiah Brandreth, the Nottingham captain, led 200 or 300 stockingers and quarrymen and ironworkers from Pentrich toward Nottingham for arms. Brandreth fired through a window and killed a farm servant, the only bloodshed, before the column scattered at the appearance of a few hussars. Thompson calls Pentrich one of the first attempts in history to mount a wholly proletarian insurrection, without any middle-class support. At the Derby trials, Oliver's name was never mentioned. Brandreth, William Turner, and Isaac Ludlam were executed, and Oliver became, in Thompson's phrase, the archetype of the radical Judas, his exposure by the Leeds Mercury having literally astounded public opinion. The section on Peterloo he regards as the climax. Peterloo, he writes, followed directly and inevitably upon Pentrich, and 1819 was a rehearsal for 1832. What it displayed was not the strength but the growing weakness of the English old regime. The radical press now carried the movement: Wooler's Black Dwarf, Carlyle's Republican, Wade's Gorgon and Black Book, Hone and Cruikshank's Political House that Jack built, which sold 100,000 copies. In Lancashire, the Constitutionalist mass demonstration matured under Bamford's discipline of cleanliness, sobriety, order, and, on Hunt's advice, peace. On the 16th of August, 1819, on St. Peter's Fields in Manchester, 60 to 100,000 people assembled, and the Manchester yeomanry, the manufacturers and shopkeepers on horseback, rode into them. It really was, Thompson insists, a massacre. 11 were killed, and the Relief Committee authenticated more than 400 injuries, 160 of them saber wounds, more than 100 of the injured women or girls. There is no term for this, Thompson writes, but class war, but it was a pitifully one-sided war. The government made itself an accomplice after the fact, sending its congratulations, and passing the 6 acts. And Peterloo passed into the movement's memory as a lasting source of guilt to its perpetrators, and of resolve to its victims. The final section, on the Cato Street conspiracy, closes the old radicalism. Alarmed at their own following, and stung by Hunt's public charge that he was a spy, Arthur Thistlewood was drawn by the provocateur, George Edwards, into a plot to murder the whole cabinet at dinner, seize the heads of Castlereagh and Sidmouth on pikes, and proclaim a provisional government at the Mansion House. The advertised cabinet dinner was a hoax. The conspirators were taken in a loft in Cato Street in February 1820. The butcher Ings protested that he was like a bullock drove into Smithfield Market to be sold, and that Lord Sidmouth had known all about it for 2 months. On the scaffold, Thistlewood declared, "I desire all here to remember that I die in the cause of liberty," and told the trembling Ings, "Be quiet, Ings. We can die without all this noise." The men, wrote one witness, died like heroes. Linked risings flickered out at Bonnymuir near Glasgow, and at Grange Moor near Barnsley, whence a captured letter mourned, "Melancholy, melancholy, melancholy, Yorkshire." So ended, Thompson writes, the old radicalism. Yet Peterloo had the most lasting influence of all, for it warned the middle class of the cost of losing its hold over the masses, and shook the confidence of the old order. Never since Peterloo, he concludes, has authority dared to use equal force against a peaceful British crowd. Thompson gives the leadership its portrait gallery. Cartwright toured 35 places in under 30 days, and at Huddersfield, a week after 14 Luddites had been executed, his meeting was broken up by the military. Place, the Benthamite, despised the London rabble, and trusted the salvation of the country to the middle class. Hunt's Vanity Thompson catches in Bamford's memory of the orator turning on a companion, "Why don't you shout, man?" Cobbett caught the government's craving for a plot in a single sentence. "They sigh for a plot. Oh, how they sigh." The twopenny trash reached, by Cobbett's claim, 200,000 by the end of 1817. The Prince Regent was mobbed on the 28th of January, 1817. The march of the Blanketeers set out and was broken up, and the spy Oliver, after the delegate meeting at Thornhill Lees was surrounded by General Byng's troops, was seen with the general's servant at a Wakefield inn, and so exposed. The old Butterley ironworker Thomas Bacon, a Paynite since 1791, was in the Crown's eyes the true instigator of Pentrich. Brandreth promised his men that the northern clouds would come down and the national debt would be wiped away. A Belper song remembered that the revolution is begun, and his wife Anne, sent as a pauper to Sutton in Ashfield, walked to Derby to take her leave of him. At the trials, Oliver's name was never spoken. Watson, tried first in London, was acquitted when the spy castle was destroyed in the witness box. The 6 acts, Thompson writes, sealed what the 16th of August had begun, and after Peterloo, Hunt's entry into London drew, by the estimate of the Times, 300,000 people, while arming and pike-making spread across the north. The Cato Street conspiracy he unfolds, with its provocateur Edwards, who had once made a bust of Paine, and its condemned men, the butcher Ings, the shoemaker Brunt, and Davidson, a man of colour from Jamaica, and its linked risings at Bonnymuir near Glasgow, under the banner Scotland Free or a Desert, and at Grange Moor near Barnsley, whence the captured letter mourned melancholy, melancholy, melancholy Yorkshire. The prosperity of the 1820s, and then the Queen Caroline agitation, took the edge off the old anger. But Peterloo, Thompson insists, left the deepest mark of all. Thompson roots the post-war disaffection in the distress that followed the Peace and the Corn Law of 1815, and in Cobbett's address to the journeymen and laborers, which told them that all their wealth sprang from labor, and that their misery sprang from the enormous weight of the taxes. He traces the moral and physical force dilemma that would run on into Chartism, and Cobbett's later defense of the Pentrich men, asking what Brandreth had done more than the Whigs had done at the Revolution of 1688. The Crown and Anchor Convention of January 1817 carried petitions of between 500,000 and 1.5 million signatures, and divided over household against manhood suffrage. The government suspended habeas corpus until July and passed a Seditious Meetings Act. The March of the Blanketeers set out from Manchester and was broken up, and the spy Oliver moved among the 4 regions of the secret committees, making large promises of Weedon Barracks and of a provisional government whose proclamation Wooler was to print. After the delegates were surrounded at Thornhill Lees and Oliver exposed, the Pentrich men rose all the same. Brandreth, promising that the north was up and the debt would be destroyed, shot a farm servant through a window, the only life lost, before the hussars scattered the column. The same night the Huddersfield men rose at Folly Hall, where the jury afterwards refused to convict. At Derby the council Denman likened Brandreth to Byron's Corsair. Brandreth, Turner, and Ludlam were hanged and beheaded. After Peterloo, Bamford remembered the emptied field, strewn with caps and bonnets and shawls and shoes, trampled, torn, and bloody. The magistrate Hay was rewarded with the rich living of Rochdale, and Earl Fitzwilliam, for protesting, was stripped of his Lord Lieutenancy. At Newcastle, a Radical Monday drew tens of thousands, and pikes were forged across the north. The Cato Street men were taken in their loft, Thistlewood running a Bow Street runner through as he fled. On the scaffold, Hobhouse recorded, the men died like heroes, and when their heads were shown to the crowd, the yells and execrations exceeded all conception. At Bonnymuir, the Scottish weavers marched under the banner Scotland Free or a Desert, and James Wilson was executed. At Grange Moor, the Barnsley men marched to an empty rendezvous. The Queen Caroline agitation that followed, Thompson says, was a portent of the new movement of the 1820s under the guidance of the middle-class utilitarians and the younger Whigs. But the memory that endured was Peterloo, which taught the middle class the cost of losing its influence over the masses. Thompson maps the regional variety of the movement, the artisan radicalism of Bristol, the deep gulf of independent feeling in South Lancashire, the more cross-class radicalism of the West Riding and of Birmingham. Cartwright, he stresses, opposed any attempt to excite the poor to invade the property of the rich, and looked for reform through the middle classes. In London, Cochrane gave way to the Benthamite Hobhouse, and Place said with weary realism that if none shows himself but Hunt, then Hunt must be their man. The Spension Society gathered Alan Davenport and the Evanses about the 2 Watsons and Thistlewood. The 3 Spafields meetings of November and December 1816 were their work, with Hunt as orator. Cobbett's twofold defection, his renunciation of the clubs and his flight to America, drew Wooler's reproach. And the backbone of the movement, Thompson insists, was the handloom weavers and stockingers of the upland townships, of Lees and Saddleworth, Middleton, Rochdale, Oldham, and Bury, not backward yokels, but the characteristic workers of the age. The cotton spinners, radical enough, produced no leaders of their own, victimized and worn by their hours, though they mounted a great strike in 1818. He records the wilder schemes, Benbow and Mitchell of the Physical Force Party, the so-called Ardwick conspiracy that served as a pretext to arrest the Lancashire leaders. Of Peterloo he insists again that the yeomanry, drawn from the manufacturers and shopkeepers, did the worst of the damage in a panic of class hatred. The Relief Committee authenticated 421 claims, 161 of them sabre wounds. Sidmouth, he notes dryly, derived more benefit from the ending of the Derby trials than from all that the medical men could give him. And he closes on Bamford, reforming 1,000 of the Middleton and Rochdale men after the massacre, and marching them home to the sound of fife and drum, with their one banner waving. Thompson stresses that radicalism after 1815 was carried, above all, by the printed word. Alongside Cobbett's Register ran Wooler's Black Dwarf, Sherwin's Register that became Carlyle's Republican, John Wade's Gorgon and his Black Book, which exposed the pensions and sinecures of old corruption, and sold 10,000 of each part, the Medusa and the Manchester Observer, and Hone and Cruikshank's Satire, the political house that Jack built, sold perhaps 100,000 copies, until Lord Eldon complained of wagons filled with seditious papers. The new Open Societies, the Stockport Political Union, the Hull Political Protestants, the British Forum, were the lawful face of a movement whose national organization remained illegal. Thompson catches the flavor of radical enterprise in Hunt's roasted corn radical breakfast powder, sold to avoid the taxed article of tea. After Peterloo, the sardonic name Peterloo fixed the massacre in memory. A radical Monday at Newcastle drew tens of thousands, and the Manchester pike-maker, Naaman Carter, worked under the eye of an informer known as Y. As the arming spread, Cobbett issued in January 1820 his plan addressed to the ladies, urging sobriety and frugality upon the movement, even as it drifted toward the desperation of Cato Street. There the provocateur Edwards led Thistlewood and his friends, the butcher Ings, the shoemaker Brunt, and Davidson, a man of color from Jamaica, first toward blowing up the House of Commons, then toward an attack on the ministers at the Spanish ambassador's fete, and at last toward the cabinet dinner, after which they were to carry the heads of Castlereagh and Sidmouth on pikes and proclaim a provisional government at the Mansion House. The dinner was a fiction. The men were taken, and at Grange Moor in the north, some 300 marched by night under a green flag to a rendezvous that proved deserted. The whole episode, Thompson says, was at once tragic and squalid, a movement betrayed by the very spies it harbored, and it marks the end of the old radicalism, and the beginning of the more disciplined, more constitutional movement that would follow. The March of the Blanketeers Thompson uses to show both the desperation and the discipline of the northern weavers, who set out to walk to London with their petitions and their blankets on their backs, and were broken up before they had well begun. He returns, too, to the paradox of leadership. With all national organization illegal, the movement could find no voice but that of the individual orator or journalist, and so was delivered over to the vanity of a hunt and the caution of a place, and to the constant danger of the spy. The radical press, he insists, was the movement's real organization, doing the work that the outlawed corresponding societies could no longer do. It was through Wooler and Carlyle and Wade, as much as through any club, that the scattered communities were bound into a single public. Of Peterloo, he adds the detail that fixes its horror: the field afterwards, in Bamford's memory, silent and empty, but for the trampled caps and bonnets and shawls and shoes, and the wounded carried away, and the swiftness with which the government made itself an accomplice, the Prince Regent's thanks to the magistrates, within the fortnight, the prosecution not of the yeomanry, but of their victims. It was this, Thompson argues, more than any rising, that revealed how far the old order had lost the consent of the governed, and why 1819 was, in his phrase, a rehearsal for 1832. Thompson is at pains to correct the older Whig history associated with the Hammonds, which held that there was no untainted evidence of any real conspiracy in these years, and that all the physical force talk was the work of spies. The truth, he argues, is more tangled and more tragic. There was a genuine current of insurrectionary preparation, thin and amateurish and easily penetrated, and it was inextricably intertwined with the provocations of men like Oliver, so that it is often impossible to say where the people's own desperation ended and the spies' incitement began. Pentrich he calls one of the first attempts in history at a wholly proletarian insurrection, mounted without any middle-class support, and he restores the humanity of its leader, Jeremiah Brandreth, the Nottingham captain. Not the illiterate desperado of the official account, but a man who could command and inspire, whose wife walked to Derby to take her leave of him before he was hanged and beheaded. The exposure of Oliver by the Leeds Mercury, Thompson says, literally astounded public opinion, and did more than any argument to discredit the government's whole system of spies. And it is against that background of official provocation that Peterloo, and then the panic legislation of the Six Acts, must be understood. Thompson finds the true strength of the post-war movement not in its famous names, but in what he calls its base, the obscure booksellers and secretaries and news vendors of Barnsley and Halifax and Rochdale, the rural patriots of the weaving townships who kept the Hampton clubs alive. It was to these men that Cobbett's Twopence Trash spoke, and it was they who sent their delegates, at real risk, to the convention at the Crown and Anchor, and who signed the great petitions of 1817. The tragedy of the movement, in Thompson's telling, was that it possessed everything but a lawful means of national action. It had numbers, conviction, a press, and local organization, but the law forbade it to combine those things into a national body, and so it was thrown back upon the orator and the journalist, and left exposed to the spy. Peterloo he reads as the moment when this contradiction became unbearable, when a disciplined, peaceable, and overwhelmingly working-class demonstration was ridden down by the mounted manufacturers of the Manchester yeomanry, and when the government, by thanking the magistrates and prosecuting the victims, made the massacre its own. What was revealed on St. Peter's Fields, he insists, was not the strength, but the growing weakness of the old order, which could no longer command the deference of the people, and had nothing left to fall back upon but the saber. It is for this reason that Peterloo, more than any victory, became the movement's most powerful memory, and that Thompson can say that never since that day has authority dared to use equal force against a peaceable British crowd. The three great meetings at Spa Fields in November and December of 1816 show both the reach and the fragility of the movement. They were organized by the little band of Spenceans, the two Watsons, Thistlewood and Preston, with Hunt brought in as the orator to draw the crowd, and while Hunt spoke of petitions, a section of the second meeting broke away toward the Tower, an outbreak in which the hand of the provocateur can be felt. It was actions like this, half serious, half provoked, that gave the government its pretext. After Peterloo, it answered with the Six Acts, a battery of measures that restricted public meetings, empowered the seizure of arms and of seditious papers, hastened the trial of offenders, and taxed the cheap press out of the reach of the poor. Taken together, Thompson argues, the Six Acts sealed what the 16th of August had begun, and drove the movement for a time off the streets, but they could not undo the memory of the massacre, nor restore to the old order the confidence it had lost. When the agitation revived, in the affair of Queen Caroline, its leadership had passed toward the middle-class reformers and the younger Whigs, a foretaste of the shape the movement would take in the 1820s. Chapter 16. Class Consciousness. In the final chapter, Thompson argues that the quiet decade of the 1820s and the Reform Bill crisis of 1830 to 1832 mark the point at which the English working people passed from fragmented crowd turbulence into a mature class consciousness, a shared awareness of common interests against other classes, embodied in institutions and in an alternative vision of society. By 1832, he declares, the working class is no longer in the making, but has been made. Class, he reminds us, is not a static thing but a happening, defined only in relationship and over time. The section called the Radical Culture describes the strangely quiet 20s not as stagnation but as seed time. As a Mayhew costermonger put it, it is when all's quiet that the seeds are growing. Popular radicalism was above all an intellectual, autodidact culture. The towns and villages hummed with the energy of the self-taught, and illiterate laborers walked weekly to a public house to hear Cobbett's Register read aloud. Its central battle was for a free press. Richard Carlile, a tinsmith, made press freedom the fulcrum of the movement, publishing Paine's works and hoisting, in Thompson's phrase, the black ensign of unqualified defiance. When he was jailed, his wife, his sister, and then some 150 volunteer shopmen came forward to serve, among them, 200 years of imprisonment. They came, Thompson says, out of a culture. William Hone's 3 acquittals for parody in 1817 had already shown that persecution cannot easily stand up in the face of ridicule. The 1830s brought the War of the Great Unstamped, Hetherington's Poor Man's Guardian defying the stamp tax under the motto, "Knowledge is power," and some 500 people prosecuted for selling the unstamped press. It was, Thompson insists, emphatically a working-class press, and its vendors, like the Nottingham woman tried while suckling her infant, were its martyrs. The character of the culture was one of moral sobriety, intellectual inquiry, and mutuality. The section on William Cobbett argues that Cobbett created this radical intellectual culture, not by originality, but by finding the tone and the arguments that brought weaver, schoolmaster, and shipwright into a common discourse. His register was, Thompson says, a circulating medium. He wrote as an equal, naming names, Parson Malthus, the thing, and assuming that every citizen had the power of reason. His weaknesses were real. He had no systematic theory. He reduced political economy to an invective against old corruption, the taxes and the debt and the paper money, rather than a critique of ownership, and he nourished the anti-intellectualism of the later labor movement. Yet his touchstone was always the condition of the laboring man. No society ought to exist, he wrote, where the laborers live in a hog-like sort of way. The relationship with his readers, Thompson says, was dialectical. It is the flint and the steel meeting that brings forth the fire. The section Carlyle, Wade, and Gast surveys the more demanding thought of the years to 1832. Carlyle ossified Paine into a rigid Republican and rationalist orthodoxy, pushing individualism to its extreme. Yet it was Carlyle, Thompson allows, who set up the market of ideas, publishing Paine and Volney and Holbach and founding the Rotunda, the cradle of London working-class debate. John Wade, in the Gorgon, attempted a junction between Benthamism and working-class experience, dividing society into the parasitic and the productive classes, and grounding value in labor, and concluding, against the orthodox economists, that combination actually worked. John Gast, the Deptford shipwright, carried the argument into the world of the trades, founding the trades newspaper under the motto, "They helped everyone his neighbor," and marking a complete rupture between middle-class utilitarianism and an emergent trade union theory. Thomas Hodgkin's labor defended against the claims of capital pushed the labor theory of value to the point of calling the capitalist a parasitic middleman. The section on Owenism argues that Owenism always contained two elements that never wholly fused: the benevolent, paternalist system-building of Robert Owen himself, and the appropriation of his ideas by working people who selected from them and reshaped them to their own ends. Owen, the model mill owner of New Lanark, had a vacant place in his mind where most men have political responses. He sailed through the revolutionary crisis of 1831 and 1832, Thompson says, without noticing that the country was in a state of crisis, and he threw the mantle of Joanna Southcott across his shoulders, proclaiming the commencement of the millennium. Hazlitt had seen it clearly that Owen's ideas were old and were tolerated only because they seemed remote and inapplicable. But working people made of Owenism something forward-looking, the first of the great social doctrines to grip the imagination of the masses, one that accepted the machine and the mill and asked only that the profit motive be removed. Its weakness, Thompson argues, was its evasion of political power and of the question of property. Yet from it, Hetherington and O'Brien learned to see capitalism not as a collection of discrete events but as a system. The final section, A Sort of Machine, gathers the argument. By 1832, the working class had been made, and its new consciousness had two aspects: an identity of interests among all working men, expressed in the general unionism of the early 30s, and an identity of the working class against other classes, within which grew the claim for an alternative system. But this final definition, Thompson stresses, was in large part the consequence of the response of the middle class to working class strength. The long counter-revolution had kept the radical movement largely working class and had bred a peculiarly repressive middle-class ideology, from Malthus to Ewer. In the Reform Bill crisis, the middle-class radicals fought on both fronts, using the threat of working-class force while negotiating their own safe admission to power. The 10-pound franchise was drawn, in Thompson's image, with the crudity of an indelible pencil deliberately excluding the working man. The National Union of the Working Classes and its rotundists denounced the bill as a trap to reinforce the aristocracy with a sub-aristocracy of the middle class, and Bronter O'Brien, the schoolmaster of Chartism, defined the classes as directly opposed as two fighting bulls, insisting that property was the thing they must be at. The betrayals that followed, the transportation of the Dorchester laborers, the lockouts, the rejection of the 10 Hours Bill, and above all, the Poor Law Amendment Act, the Starvation Law, confirmed the new consciousness. What the working people refused, in the words of a hand-loom weaver Thompson quotes, was to be made a sort of machine, to work according to the pleasure of government. Thompson mourns the failed junction between the romantic critique of utilitarianism and the radical craftsman, and pays his final tribute. This was, he writes, perhaps the most distinguished popular culture England has known, and its people had nourished, for 50 years, and with incomparable fortitude, the Liberty Tree. Thompson grounds the radical culture in the fact of a growing literacy, perhaps 2 of every 3 working men able to read after some fashion, and in the laborer who could not read walking weekly to the public house to hear Cobbett's Register read aloud. He follows Wickwar's history of the struggle for the press. William Hone's parodies, including a parody of the Lord's Prayer that began, "Our Lord who art in the Treasury," brought 3 acquittals in December 1817 that were said to have finished Lord Chief Justice Ellenborough. He gives the circulation figures, Cobbett's 2-penny Register running to 40 or 60,000 a week, his History of the Protestant Reformation selling over 200,000, and Doherty's Manchester Newsroom taking 96 papers a week, and the martyrs of the unstamped, such as the Macclesfield hatter, Joseph Swan, who took his 4.5 years, sentenced with the promise that whenever I come out, I'll hawk them again. He illustrates Cobbett's genius with the famous scarecrow, the shoy-hoy, with which he mocked the sham reformers, and sets his plain, name-naming prose against the polished, elusive radicalism of Hazlitt. He anatomizes the other tendencies, Carlyle's rigid Republican orthodoxy, that the writings of Thomas Paine alone form a standard for anything worthy of being called radical reform, and his founding of the Rotunda where the national union of the working classes would meet. John Wade's appeal to general utility and his division of society into the productive and the parasitic, John Gast's Committee of the Useful Classes, which welcomed Hunt in 1822, and Hodgkin's Labor Defended. On Owenism he adds Owen's new view of society and the radicals, scorn for his parallelograms of paupers, the labor note exchanges of 1832 and 1833, and the Rippondan Society's creed that labor is the source of all wealth, consequently the working classes have created all wealth, why not? He carries the general unionism forward to Doherty's National Association, the Builders' Union, and the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union, and the syndicalist vision of a movement that would abolish wages and swallow up the whole political power, lost, he says, in the terrible defeats of 1834 and 1835. In the Reform Bill crisis, he insists, revolution was possible. The 10-pound franchise was drawn so that, as Baines found in working-class Leeds, not one householder in 50 would have a vote. The Rotundists demonstrated 70 and 100,000 strong, and Wellington saw the contest as 2 armies in each other's presence. Bronte O'Brien defined a government of the middle classes as the most grinding of all, and cried, "Property, property, this is the thing we must be at." The Poor Law of 1834, the Starvation Law, and the transportation of the Dorchester laborers confirmed the lesson. James Morrison spoke for the excluded. Orphans we are, he said, and bastards of society, and Thompson hears in it not resignation, but pride. Thompson opens the radical culture with the Mayhew costermonger's remark that Republicans and Socialists are pressing their doctrines, and with an example of the folly of generalization, setting a polished Luddite letter beside a barely literate Chesterfield note about blowing up Parliament. Carlyle, he says, would not even admit of the possibility of defeat, and had the culture of the artisans at his back. His volunteers, James Watson and James Mann, and the old corresponding society man John Gale Jones, went cheerfully to prison, and the vendor Mrs. Wright was tried while suckling her infant. The Great Unstamped of 1830 to 1836, Hetherington's Poor Man's Guardian, and Hobson's Voice of the West Riding, carried the frontal assault on the tax on knowledge. The age believed, Thompson says, in the printing press as a multiplication table of the mind, and for 20 years the multiplications seemed to work. He stresses the sobriety of the culture, Lovett's motto of bread, knowledge, and freedom, and the capture of the mechanics, institutes by Brougham and the political economists. Cobbett's opportunism he does not hide, the professed loyalty to throne and constitution and church that went with an assault that nearly brought them down. But his touchstone was the laborer, and his bond with his readers was the flint and the steel that brings forth fire. And it kept the radicals, with his friend and fellow Oldham member John Fielden, close to being the spokesman of the working class. Carlyle's rationalism, by contrast, pushed individualism to its limit, each man doing his duty without reference to his neighbor, which Thompson calls a petit bourgeois blindness to the very essence of a working-class movement. Wade concluded that the workers, condition depended on their power to command, and even to extort, a high price for their labor. Gast, first Secretary of the Thames Shipwrights' Provident Union and moving spirit of the philanthropic Hercules, brought trade union theory to a complete rupture with middle-class utilitarianism, and Hodgkin declared that the only thing which can be said to be stored up is the skill of the laborer. Owen, backed by the Archbishop of Canterbury and closeted with Sidmouth, proclaimed on the 1st of May 1833 the commencement of the millennium. Marx's third thesis on Feuerbach, that the educator must himself be educated, Thompson turns against Owen's mechanical materialism. Around the edges ran the old millenarial instability, the crippled shoemaker Zion Ward, who called himself Shiloh, and the rising in Blean Wood in 1838 under Sir William Courtenay, which Thompson calls the last peasants' revolt, with a higher death roll than Pentrich or Peterloo. The Spensions alone, he notes, had squarely posed the question of property, demanding nothing less than the complete extermination of the present system of holding land, and Hetherington's last will professed his ardent attachment to the principles of that great and good man, Robert Owen. In the Reform crisis, the middle-class radicals, the Times among them, even urged the forming of political societies, while drawing the 10-pound line in Thompson's image with the crudity of an indelible pencil. At Birmingham, Atwood's political union stayed under middle-class control because, as Asa Briggs showed, the local economy multiplied the number of small producing units. But by 1833, the 180,000 of Newhall Hill were radicalizing toward Chartism. O'Brien defined the classes as two fighting bulls, and the syndicalist visionaries, Benbow, with his grand national holiday, and the writers of the Pioneer, dreamed of a house of trades that would abolish wages and swallow the whole political power, a vision lost in the defeats of 1834 and 1835. The Leeds election of 1832, in which the manufacturers Marshall and Macaulay faced Sadler of the 10 Hours movement and Osler's short-time committees, dramatized the split, and James Morrison's cry, "Orphans we are and bastards of society," Thompson hears as pride, not resignation. Thompson sets Cobbett's plain style against Hazlitt's, which aimed, he says, not towards the popular but towards the polite culture, and he finds in Cobbett's history of the Protestant Reformation the striking argument that the poor had a historic right to maintenance from the land, the old poor laws being compensation for the tithes and charities stolen at the dissolution. Carlyle he judges a Philistine, who dismissed Byron's Don Juan as mere slip-slop, and whose rationalism was made up of negations, yet it was Carlyle who set up the market of ideas at the Rotunda in 1830. Owen he places precisely, not the first of the modern socialist theorists, but one of the last of the 18th century rationalists, a man with a vacant place in his mind where most men have political responses, whose plan for villages of cooperation Cobbett mocked as parallelograms of paupers and Sherwin as a community of slaves. Hazlitt had told him his ideas were old, Master Robert Owen, and tolerated only because they seemed remote and inapplicable. By the early 30s there were perhaps 500 cooperative societies with some 20,000 members. The peculiarity of English development, Thompson argues, was a long counter-revolution that kept the radical movement working class and bred a peculiarly repressive middle-class ideology, running from Godwin through Bentham to Malthus, McCulloch, and Ure, and on to Baines, Macaulay, and Chadwick. Gray's whole aim was to associate the middle with the higher orders. The poor man's guardian denounced the Reform Bill as a scheme to reinforce the aristocracy with a sub-aristocracy of the middle class. The syndicalist vision of the pioneer and of Bray's labor's wrongs and labor's remedies, of Benbow's grand national holiday and Doherty and Fielden's Society for National Regeneration, imagined unions that would abolish wages in a house of trades that would swallow the political power. It was lost, Thompson says, almost as soon as it was found. And the betrayals that followed the Reform Act confirmed the new class feeling. The transportation of the Dorchester laborers, the lockouts and the document forced on the unions, the Irish Coercion Bill, the rejection of the 10 Hours Bill, and the Poor Law Amendment Act. The vote, in the end, symbolized equality and a social control over the conditions of life and labor, and Thompson mourns the failed junction between the great romantic critique of utilitarianism in Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge, and the radicalism of the craftsman, a junction that, had it been made, might have given the movement a fuller vision. Thompson widens the account of the radical culture to take in the theater riots and the great tradition of the political print, of Gilray and Rawlinson and Cruikshank, whose caricatures were a popular schooling in politics. He returns to Owen with a sharper judgment. The mill owner of New Lanark had set out to remoralize the lower orders and to devise span-new systems of society, and his journal, The Crisis, sailed through the revolutionary years of 1831 and 1832, without noticing, Thompson says, that the country was in a state of crisis at all. What made Owenism a force was not Owen, but the use working people made of it, turning a paternalist scheme into the first of the great social doctrines to grip the imagination of the masses, a doctrine that accepted the machine and asked only that the profit motive be removed. The two aspects of the new class consciousness Thompson defines with care: the sense of an identity of interests among all working men, whatever their trade, which found expression in the general unions of the early 30s, and the sense of the working class as set against the other classes of society, within which grew the demand for a wholly different ordering of things. The National Union of the Working Classes carried that second sense into the streets, demonstrating 70 and 100,000 strong, until the Duke of Wellington himself saw the struggle as one between the establishment and the rotunda, two armies drawn up in each other's presence. And when the middle class secured its reform and then turned on its late allies, the working people learned the lesson of 1832 in their own flesh. The vote they were denied became, in Thompson's phrase, the symbol of equality and of a social control over the conditions of their own lives, and the refusal to be made a mere instrument of another's will became the ground of everything that followed. The struggle for the free press Thompson treats as the central battle of the radical culture, and he follows it in loving detail. William Hone, tried 3 times in 3 days in December 1817 for his parodies, defended himself with such wit that the juries acquitted him each time, and Lord Chief Justice Ellenborough, who had presided, was said never to have recovered. Richard Carlile, imprisoned again and again, simply refused to be beaten. When he was jailed, his wife and his sister carried on the shop, and when they too were jailed, a succession of volunteer shopmen came forward from across the country to be arrested in their turn, until, among them, they had served some 200 years in prison. They came, Thompson says, out of a culture of the self-taught artisan, sober, inquiring, and combative, whose motto, in Lovett's words, was bread, knowledge, and freedom. The War of the Great, unstamped in the 1830s, carried the fight to a victorious conclusion. Hetherington's Poor Man's Guardian, printed defiantly in the teeth of the law. Some 500 people prosecuted for selling the penny papers. Thompson is equally attentive to the constructive side of the movement, the friendly societies and the cooperative stores, the Owenite labor exchanges, where goods were priced in notes of labor time, the trade societies feeling their way toward a general union of all the trades. And he brings the whole book to its climax in the Reform Bill crisis, when, he insists, revolution was genuinely possible, when the middle-class reformers used the threat of the crowd to win their own admission to power, and then drew the 10-pound franchise so as to shut the working man out. And when the betrayals that followed, the transported laborers of Tolpuddle, the lockouts, and above all the new Poor Law, taught the working people, once and for all, that they were a class alone. It was then, Thompson concludes, that the class which had been in the making for 40 years knew itself, at last, to have been made. Thompson insists that the culture of these years was, at its best, a genuinely intellectual one, and that its characteristic institution was not the mob, but the reading group, the debating society, and the cheap periodical. He traces the 4 distinct tendencies of radical thought after 1817, the doctrinaire republicanism of Carlyle in the Paynite tradition, the working-class utilitarianism of Wade and the Gorgon, the trade union theory of Gast and his trades newspaper, and the cooperative socialism drawn from Owen, and he shows how, for all their quarrels, they converged upon a single perception that the productive labor of the working people was the source of all wealth, and that the existing order robbed them of its fruits. Hodgkin gave the argument its sharpest form, that the only thing truly stored up is the skill of the laborer, and that the capitalist had insinuated himself as a parasitic middleman between the producers. It is this perception, carried into the general unions and the cooperative stores and the unstamped press, that Thompson takes as the mark of a mature class consciousness. And he ends by weighing what was lost as well as what was won. The failure to join the great imaginative critique of industrialism in Blake and Wordsworth and the young Coleridge, to the practical radicalism of the craftsman, a junction that might have given the movement a richer vision of what human life could be. What the working people achieved, even so, was, in his final estimate, one of the most remarkable popular cultures in English history, and it is to their fortitude, sustained through 40 years of defeat, that the book is a monument. The reading culture of the radical years Thompson describes with real affection, the laborer who could not read walking each week to the alehouse to hear another read Cobbett's Register aloud, the little societies that pooled their pennies to take a newspaper, the shopmen who went cheerfully to prison rather than see the free press extinguished. He insists that this was, above all, a culture of self-respect and self-improvement, sober and inquiring, that set a high value on knowledge as the instrument of its own emancipation. He shows how the different schools of radical thought, for all their bitter quarrels, taught the same lesson, that the working people were a class with interests of their own, opposed to those of the men who lived upon their labor, and that no reform of Parliament alone would set them free. And he brings the argument to its conclusion in the years of the Reform Bill, when the working people, having lent their strength to the middle-class agitation, found themselves shut out by the £10 franchise and then punished, in the transportation of the Dorchester laborers and the cruelty of the new Poor Law, for daring to combine on their own account. It was in that experience of betrayal, Thompson argues, that the class which had been 40 years in the making came at last to a full and bitter consciousness of itself. Class, he reminds us in his final pages, is not a thing that can be weighed or counted at a single moment, but a relationship that reveals itself only over time, in the friction of real interests and the struggles of living men and women. And the making of the English working class was, in the end, a process of self-discovery, by which a great mass of ordinary people came to understand who they were, and what, together, they might become. The cooperative and trade union movements of the early 1830s Thompson treats as the practical embodiment of the new consciousness. Out of the Owenite ferment came some 500 cooperative societies, the labor exchanges in which the products of work were bartered against notes reckoned in hours of labor, and above all, the drive toward a single general union of all the trades, which reached its height in the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union. For a few extraordinary months it seemed to some that the unions might simply take over the work of society, abolishing wages and the wage system together, and governing production through a parliament of the trades. And though this syndicalist vision was shattered in the defeats of 1834 and 1835, it left behind it a lasting sense that the working class might be not merely a pressure upon society, but an alternative principle of its organization. It is in these institutions, Thompson argues, and in the men who built them, the shipwright Gast, the spinner Doherty, the printer Hetherington, that we see most clearly the working class that had been made, no longer a collection of separate trades and grievances, but a movement conscious of itself, with its own press, its own leaders, its own theory, and its own vision of a juster world. The story the book tells does not end in 1832, but opens out toward the Chartist years that lie beyond it, for the class that had come to consciousness in the defeats of the Reform crisis would carry its demand for the vote, and for a social order answerable to the people, into the great movement of the following decade. Thompson's achievement in the end is to have shown that this class was not the passive byproduct of economic forces, but the active maker of its own identity, forged in a particular English experience of dissent and constitutional right, of exploitation and repression, of defeat born with an extraordinary fortitude. The working people of these years, he insists, were not the raw material of history, but its agents, and if much of what they hoped for was lost, the tradition they created of solidarity, of self-education, and of resistance to injustice was handed on, and remains, he suggests, among the most valuable things in the whole inheritance of the English people. It is worth adding that Thompson's insistence on class as a happening and not a thing is not a mere verbal point but the governing idea of the whole book. It is why he begins with traditions and beliefs rather than with statistics of production, and why he ends not with an institution but with a state of mind. The working class on this view could no more be read off from the census returns than a friendship can be read off from a list of names. It existed only in the way men and women came to act and to feel together, and it is that living, moving reality that the book has tried, throughout, to recover. Postscript. Written 5 years after first publication, Thompson's postscript is a combative reply to his critics. He offers the minimum of revisions and defends the book against 3 lines of attack: his treatment of Methodism, his handling of the episodes of 1811 to 1819, and his method, above all, his analysis of class. He concedes that the chapter on standards and experiences is an ungenerous one, but lets it stand as a polemic against an economic history that had become, he says, a commitment to the ideology of economic growth in danger of reducing a discipline to propaganda. He accepts that he wrote too little of the early factory workers and of the flag-saluting, foreigner-hating, peer-respecting side of the plebeian mind. But more knowledge, he insists, will not explain away the emergence of a class movement in the 1830s. On Methodism, he rejects the caricatures of his critics and restates his real interest, which was the experience of Methodism between 1780 and 1820, and its function as a carrier of work discipline. He weighs his own chiliasm of despair thesis against the rival views of Halevi and Hobsbawm, and concludes that the evidence is inconclusive, though the oscillation between the platform and the chapel seems to him real. On the underground tradition, he admits that he was, if anything, too reticent, and points to the shoemaker Charles Pendrell as a concrete link chaining the corresponding society of 1798 to Despard, to Spa Fields, and to the introduction of Oliver in 1817. But the real question, he says, is not conspiratorial. Why did men and ideas which were isolated in 1795 receive such widespread support 20 years later? The theoretical climax is his defense of the idea of class. Against the charge that he has imposed the category of class upon a plural society, and that his working class remains a myth, he restates that class and class consciousness are cultural formations, never a card of membership. He repeats his famous image. The sociologist who stops the time machine cannot locate a class, because class is not this or that part of the machine, but the way the machine works once it is set in motion, the friction of interests, the movement itself, the heat, the thundering noise. Class, he insists, is not a thing, it is a happening. And he closes the whole book on that word. This book, he writes, is an attempt to describe this happening, this process of self-discovery and of self-definition. Thompson names his critics, Curry and Hartwell, Chambers and Himmelfarb, and answers them one by one. The largest set piece concerns Nottingham Luddism, where against Church and Chapman, he defends his suggestion of an oscillation between Luddite and constitutionalist protest, probably under the single leadership of Grosvenor Hinson. On the timing, he is precise. The framework knitters organize only 3 days before the frame-breaking bill's first reading. And he lays down his key structural point. Fewer frames were broken in Nottingham than in the out villages because the organization of the town workers was stronger, so that the villages were the frontier between organization and disorganization. He points to George Mellor, the well-paid Yorkshire cropper earning 35 shillings a week, to refute what he calls the crass economism that assumes the lowest paid must be the most militant. And to the ideological historians who knock the sentimental Hammonds with impunity, he replies with a flash of defiance, "But I am neither genteel nor, as yet, dead." The making of the class, he concludes, was both a change in the whole background of popular feeling and, from 1816, the working out of ideas and organizations that prefigured the 1830s. It was also a question of morale, of the spirit caught in the young blanketeer's note of 1817, "I am a true reformer yet, and I do not care who knows it." Thompson frames the Methodist debate as a contest between what he wryly calls the Thompson thesis and the Halevi thesis, and quotes Himmelfarb's suspicion that the muted Marxist argument amounted to a united front against a common enemy, replying only that the evidence is inconclusive and that the oscillators between chapel and platform were the floating voters of their day. He cites a West Riding clergyman's complaint that his Methodists had united with the radicals and were reading the works of Wooler and Cobbett, and he restates the twofold character of the making of the class, a change in the whole background of popular disposition, marked in London in 1795, in Nottingham in 1796, and at Merthyr in 1831, and from 1816, the working out of the ideas and organizations that prefigured the movements of the 1830s. Thompson concedes the book's omissions with candor, that he has said too little of the early factory workers, the miners, the iron workers, and the transport workers, and too little of the deferential, patriotic side of the plebeian mind. On Methodism, he answers Curry and Hartwell, who had quoted his phrase about psychic masturbation 3 times in 4 paragraphs, and Chambers, who had reduced his argument to frustrated revolutionaries, bawling about the blood of the Lamb. His real concern, he repeats, was why working people accepted so passionate a Lutheranism, and how it served as a carrier of work discipline. He weighs the awkward cases once more, the Cornish tinners of 1814 who fall outside his thesis, and the Shropshire colliers of 1821 who fit it exactly. And he ends, as the book ends, on the insistence that class is not a thing, but a relationship and a process. The historian's task is to catch it in motion, in the friction of interests and the heat of the movement itself. This concludes Part 3, The Working Class Presence, and with it the summary of the whole of Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. Across the 3 parts, Thompson has followed a single vast process, the drawing together of the traditions of dissent, and the freeborn Englishman, and the Jacobin decade, the shared experience of exploitation among field laborer, artisan, and weaver, and the emergence, through Luddism, through Pentrich and Peterloo, and through the radical culture of the unstamped press and the trade societies, of a people who had come to understand themselves as a class. The working class, he has argued throughout, was not simply the creature of the steam engine or the passive victim of history. It was present at its own making, and by 1832 it had made itself.